I had it before.
Oh, okay, sorry.
Thank you very much for staying on for these technical briefings. Actually, we'll have two technical briefings, given the amount of measures that were presented by the Commission today. So the first part of the briefing will focus on the economic situation, the Stability and Growth Pact, state aid issues, as well as internal market. It is my pleasure to introduce to you the colleagues on the podium with me. So Maarten Vervey, Director-General of Economic and Financial Affairs, Monsieur Olivier Guersent, Director-General for Competition, as well as Gwenole Cozigou, Director-General for Internal Market and Industry. So this is an on-the-record briefing so that also colleagues who are at home today can also watch us and listen to us. We will start with a short presentation on the economic situation and the other issues, and then we will be ready to take up your questions. And just to finish off, the second part of our technical briefing will focus on the coronavirus response investment initiative. So I would then ask to keep those questions for the second part of the briefing. Thank you. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon. Indeed, my presentation can be relatively short because the President and the Vice Presidents have said most of the things already. Just very briefly, what we are seeing indeed is a growth forecast that is deteriorating very rapidly. Just to recall, in February we came out with our winter forecast. At that point in time, we still thought that the EU economy would grow with 1.4% and the euro area with 1.2%. But what is clear after everything is happening that we need to adjust that and probably quite significantly. There's no hard data still available, so we cannot at this point make a new forecast. That will come in May, but what we can do and have done is to take our baseline scenario or our forecast and see how that would change if we introduce the shocks that we now are aware of. And on the basis of this modeling exercise, we can say indeed that it's very likely indeed that growth for the euro area and for the EU as a whole will fall below zero this year and potentially even considerably below zero. So in making that analysis, we sorry? Below zero, sorry. Below zero, yes. Yes. In the EU and the euro area, yes. So in making that analysis, we have looked at the different channels through which growth will be impacted. Now, first, it started all with in China, so we have the spillovers from China. Then we have supply side effects caused by the disruption of supply chain and also by increased absenteeism. Staff is sick or in containment. Then these effects are compounded by demand effects. Was mentioned before. We already see a big impact on tourism, on restaurants, on retail. And people may be inclined to increase their precautionary savings. Then a very important channel is the liquidity channel. As a result of these disruptions in supply chain and lack of demand, companies are increasingly facing liquidity constraints, and that again has an impact on also investment plans. And on top of all that, and we have seen that in the financial markets for the past couple of weeks, in particular this week, there is an increased uncertainty which weighs also on the overall economic sentiment. Now, what does that do? I think what we show in this graph, which you will find in the annex of the communication, is essentially two things. It's one, that indeed growth will come out most likely quite far below the forecast that we made in February. But very importantly, that where it comes out exactly depends to a large extent on whether or not policy measures are taken. And I think that is the really important message. There is actually quite a bit that can be done to mitigate the impact of this shock. The other point to note here is that yes, growth will fall or turn negative most likely this year, but we can expect normally that growth will be bounced back next year. But it is very important, as the President has said, to make sure that the period of decline is as short as possible and that we bounce back as quickly as possible, also to avoid long-term damage to the economy. Now, this requires an economic response on all levels, as the President has said. The most important level being, for now, the member states. They have, in comparison to the EU budget, obviously more space to react. And you can see progressively that they are reacting. So what should be done? Clearly, it's a no-brainer. We have public health expenditures that need to be funded. Then secondly, very importantly, the liquidity support for companies. This can make a very significant impact in terms of cushioning the shock. It is important that there is income support for workers and related to work disruption. And as I think also the President has said, I think we need to stand ready, and member states need to stand ready to do what is necessary to make sure that this fall back is as short as possible. Now, others will comment on and will give an overview of other measures that can be taken on the EU level. Notably, Gert Koopman will speak more about that. But here, just to say that we're working very closely with the EIB to see how we can together also contribute to providing more liquidity to companies. As a first step, we can make available approximately 1 billion in guarantee capacity, which allows for additional liquidity support. We estimate at 8 billion for companies. This can be done very, very rapidly. I would say this is a conservative estimate. The discussions with EIB are ongoing, and I think that this may go up in maybe the days or weeks to come. But this is something that we can deliver very fast. Then turning to now, how is this all going to work with the Stability and Growth Pact rules? So measures taken by member states. And I think, as the President has very clearly stated, the rules of the Stability and Growth Pact, they provide actually quite a bit of flexibility, and what we're saying here today, we will propose, at least to the Council, also to use that flexibility. Now, just to take you briefly to, well, where does the flexibility come from in concrete terms? As a first point, and this is always true, regardless of whether there is a crisis or not, when we assess the compliance with fiscal rules, we always correct for the impact of automatic economic stabilizers, so the effect of the cycle, so you will, and also one-off measures. And if you look at what member states do already, a lot of the measures that are taken are probably going to be covered by this rule, and also if growth goes down, tax revenues will go down. This is catered for in the pact, and that in itself will stabilize, provide stabilization to the economy. There is also the so-called unusual events clause, which provides the opportunity to give to accommodate exceptional spending related to unusual events outside of the control of the government. And we believe, and I'm sure you would all agree, that this is actually applicable today. So that provides another layer of flexibility already. Then there is indeed also a possibility, and if growth in a member state is severely hit, which at least for some member states we can already say that it will be the case, then there is always the possibility to modulate the so-called fiscal effort that is required of a member state. So we can take that into account in terms of a severe economic downturn. And then the last clause, and this was also mentioned already, there is a general clause in the Stability and Growth Pact, or for this particular area in the Stability and Growth Pact, that allows that if in case that there is a broad-based recession or downturn in the EU or the euro area, to trigger that, and that accommodates could accommodate a more expansionary fiscal policy. So these instruments, they are all there, or this flexibility is all there, and I think the key message is the Stability and Growth Pact will not stand in the way of a forceful crisis response. That is it for me.
Very good. Thank you very much, Olivier.
Neither will state control. Bon après-midi, mesdames et messieurs.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen.
En français. Mais vous obligez la moitié des collègues à prendre leurs écouteurs.
But that means half of you have to scramble for your headsets, doesn't it?
Ja, of Netherlands, als je wil. Ja, waarom niet? Well, no, well, I stick to English, if you don't mind. So the first thing that's important to say is that there are many initiatives, including some of which, I speak slowly for the French speaker, including some of which that have been announced by member states, like, for example, alleviation or postponement, suspension of payments for taxes or corporate contributions, social contributions. None of this needs to be notified or approved by the Commission. A general measure of the type of the one President Macron, for example, announced yesterday evening. The same goes with measures that compensate citizens. For example, citizens whose flights have been cancelled and the tickets would not be refundable, etc., etc. So direct measures to citizens or general measures benefiting all undertakings need not be notified. They can be announced and implemented right away. And the same goes, of course, mostly relevant these days to direct support granted to sectors within the public remit, and one can immediately think about hospitals. All this is no aid. All this can be done, doesn't need to be notified or approved. Now, where the state measures need to be notified and approved, then, as Margrethe Vestager just explained, we have equipped ourselves in order to be able to, first of all, channel the member states to one single point of contact and help them design the measure so that it can, without any problem, be approved very quickly. So make it state aid compatible, which sometimes includes having a design rather than another. We will help for that. And the same goes actually for the structural fund, what Gert will talk about in a minute. And this is because, unfortunately, we have some experience with emergency situations in which member states need to grant aid. Most recently, the mad cow disease 20 years ago, it was the case. 9/11, of course, the financial crisis, and also the most recent occurrence was the Icelandic volcano airline crisis. So we have this central point of contact, and we will try to provide member states with clearance within at most 24 hours of a complete notification. We have actually already approved the first case yesterday within 24 hours for a compensation for holes in which concerts should have been taken place and compensating the losses for the organizers. Secondly, member states can use this dedicated channel in order to put to us their schemes or individual decision. They can support companies that face acute liquidity problems due to the COVID-19 crisis. And for this, they can do it under the Article 107 and 3C of the treaty, as interpreted by our rescue and restructuring guidelines. And then basically we can very quickly approve the granting of liquidity to companies. They can put forward comprehensive support schemes for SMEs and small state-owned enterprises, including temporary restructuring support for up to 18 months. And for large enterprises, they can notify individual rescue aid if necessary, and this will be dealt with through the same channel. We recognize the exceptional nature of the COVID-19 outbreak, which means that we will apply a number of flexibilities. And in particular, the first one is that to the extent the aid is meant to compensate the losses due to the crisis and not to cope for other weaknesses that were pre-existing, we will grant exceptions where relevant to the one-time, last-time principle, which is, as you know, the principle under which you cannot have for 10 years a new aid if you were beneficiary of such an aid. So, of course, in these exceptional circumstances, when the aid is strictly motivated by the COVID-19 outbreak, we will make exception. Third, member states can also decide to support specific sectors, and this by nature are state aid, because by their very nature they are targeted and therefore selective, as we say. You can guess the sectors: tourism, the airline industry, the events industry. It has started already, but they are the likely target of such aid schemes. Maybe in time, that's not the case for the time being, but the banking sector, or actually, as we start to see, the real economy through the banking sector. So in other words, to guarantee banks for that they continue to provide finances to their clients, where under normal market circumstances they might stop it, and this is not what we want. So all this is doable under Article 107(2)(b) of the treaty that allows us to approve this type of heads, providing, of course, they compensate again the consequence of the COVID-19 outbreak on not pre-existing weaknesses. Last word maybe to say that in the most affected member states, currently Italy, but at the pace at which things develop, maybe other member states, and at some point maybe a significant number of member states. In these member states, there is a serious disturbance of the whole of the economy, and that is clearly the case for Italy. Let's see what will be the situation in countries like this country or France, given the measures that have been announced yesterday. We monitor these issues on a daily basis. By the way, linking back to the discussion with the President, most of the people, or all of the people dealing with this issue are critical staff, so therefore they work. Because, of course, we need to have people to process these notifications and assist the member states on a continuous basis. So when this is the case, so when Article 107(3)(b) is activated, well, then it's different, because then the crisis is systemic in that member state. And therefore, it's not simply limited to covering individual loss to individual companies due to the crisis, but you enter into the possible territory of aids to back the economy, so that as to avoid that it collapses and that it maintains until the return of recovery. For the time being, we have activated this possibility for Italy, and if and when necessary, we will activate it for other member states. If there is a significant number of member states that are in this situation, we don't rule out the possibility to adopt more general measures, which we have done in the past at the beginning of the financial crisis. That covers my presentation. Thank you, and up to Gwen.
Merci Olivier. Pour suivre ton bon exemple.
Thank you, Olivier. Well, to follow your good example, I'm going to continue in English. Not? Well, I'll take 3 points.
3 strands. The first strands concern personal protection equipment, medicines, to avoid blockage in the internal market. So basically, there have been several measures that were adopted, as the President mentioned. These measures need to be notified to the Commission. In that case, we analyze them as a matter of priority. If needed, and that was the case, we've been in contact with the Member States in order for them to make the necessary changes when needed. And because we consider that these restrictions were not adopted in a way that is acceptable, would actually prevent this equipment to go where they are badly needed. We want to preserve also a solidarity approach within the EU. And we see that they have as an effect to create bottlenecks, to disrupt value chains, and even encourage stockpiling. So this is the reason why we are addressing them as a matter of priority, and we are actually also issuing guidance for member states on how to put in place adequate control mechanism to ensure security of supply across Europe. So that's one first strand. Still on personal protection equipment, the second strand is basically that we're in contact. We basically want to make sure that there is the supply of sufficient equipment. So we're in constant contact with member states and manufacturers in order to see what the situation is, what the possibility for increasing production is. We also have launched an accelerated joint procurement procedure with 26 member states for such equipment. We're extending the existing implementing act under the EU civil protection mechanism for the Union to buy such equipment as well. And the first, that should be ready by beginning of April, member states accepting it. And we also, just today, the Commission adopted a recommendation which allows the facilitation and speeding up of certification measures for personal protection equipment. The idea is to facilitate the supply of course, protection equipment which is safe, but at the same time that might not be CE marked, but would actually correspond to WHO recommendations. The third strand is, of course, wider. It's last but not least, it's the economy. So we are following the situation of sectors and beyond sectors ecosystems in order to see whether urgent action is needed. Of course, the measures presented by my two colleagues benefit to the whole economy, but there might be a need for more targeted actions, either for SMEs or for given areas. One example among the things that we are now preparing is that we will make available 1 billion euros from the budget to act as a guarantee for the European investment funds via the existing programs Koopman and ECFIN. And the idea with that is that with the backing of that guarantee, that's about 8 billion that could be mobilized actually for small, medium-sized businesses and small mid-caps. We consider that could benefit to roughly 100,000 of those. Second example, in the transport sector, we are basically preparing at the moment measures concerning the obligation to use slots by airlines in order for them not to be confronted to this obligation for a temporary period, so that they don't need to operate with empty aircraft just to preserve their slots. Just to give you a slight example, but that's basically the picture.
Thank you very much. We will take your questions, and I'll try to group them. The lady here was front.
Catherine Fior, EU reporter. Yesterday, the President of the European Central Bank, Christine Lagarde, said repeatedly that Europe needs an ambitious and coordinated fiscal policy response. Now, Executive Vice President Dombrovskis has made it clear there's a lot of flexibility, etc. But are you going to be putting forward to the Eurogroup and to ECOFIN next week that there is a need for this coordinated and ambitious response from all ministries? I mean, as you say, you've got, those powers are kind of beyond you, but will you be putting that forward to the ministers? Also, what was mentioned yesterday was that Christine Lagarde said that she expected the measures used to support banks to be used to support the economy and not to increase dividend distributions and remuneration. I mean, I don't know who in the panel would be able to answer that, but are you able to ensure that that money is, or those measures are used indeed to protect businesses rather than dividends and remuneration?
I'll take one or two more questions, please, here.
Good afternoon. I'll ask in English, if that's okay. Oui, je peux poser la question en français, si vous voulez.
Well, I can ask it in French if you like.
The notion of one time, last time. It just strikes me that this might apply to airlines, which have in the past received aid. And if you can comment specifically about Italy. You mentioned Italy specifically as a country that needs support and has actually been the first to receive this backing under the new framework. So, Alitalia, in-depth probe. I know you're smiling because c'est une question un peu pointue. In-depth probe was announced just recently of the 400 million euro loan granted to Alitalia. So just if I can understand this well, one time, last time, would you not look at that as a one time, last time? Would the slate be wiped clean if Alitalia is suffering again with COVID-19.
One more question I'll take, and then I'll give you the floor. Here in the middle, please.
Thank you. It's Georg van Herk for Channel 4 News. The UK's clearly no longer a member state, but can you explain if any of these measures will apply to the UK, the state aid flexibility, for example, the £37 billion package, is any of that open to the UK? And secondly, on the economic forecast of zero or negative growth, does that include the UK? Thank you.
Okay, I propose we start with the economic questions, and then we move to state aid, and then to...
Yeah. Okay. To the first question, I would like to refer to the title, actually, of the communication that came out today, which is Coordinated Economic Response to the COVID-19 Outbreak. So it's very clear where the Commission is. We do believe that a coordinated economic response, which is actually wider than just a fiscal response, we need a response on all levels. That is what we're aiming for. Now, to be clear, we also need to see what is it that is most urgently needed. And there I gave this categorization. So, and I talked about what you can see is can have a very big effect in the short run is this liquidity for companies. So, and we believe we can do something there, and I've mentioned one measure, but clearly there's a lot that member states can do, and I would actually expect, and you have seen also the German statement, that member states are actually acting on that. And I think Monday is if the Eurogroup meets, it's a good moment to take stock of all that. Now, on the dividend and what can you do to keep it in, etc. I think Olivier, from his previous job, is probably better placed than I am to respond to that. But I want to make one point in relation to this, which goes in the same direction as the comment that the President of the European Central Bank made. What the ECB can do is to provide liquidity to banks, but what it cannot do is to make sure that it then ends up in companies. And that's also why it is important that the measures of the ECB are complemented by measures of the member state on the EU level to give that a push. So that either by providing liquidity for or guarantees for working capital, which take over some risk for banks, or allowing firms to keep liquidity in the firm. So there are things that can be done, and I think in the European context, it's the financial supervisors that can indeed give directions to banks, and maybe Olivier, you want to say a bit more on that.
All right. Mathieu, comme tu es français, je te répondrai dans la même langue. Pour Alitalia.
Well, I'll answer in French since you asked the question. For Alitalia, like all of the other cases, we need to draw a distinction, and you need to look at the consequences of the current crisis. When you talk about Article 172B, you need to look at losses generated by the current crisis. Now, what does that mean? Do you stick to just that? And then, where there are state aid measures, I mean, when there are investigations, we look at the legality. But again, that's a different issue. It is quite probable, quite likely, that all of the airlines will suffer a lot from this crisis. So it can't be ruled out that they will need to be compensated. Simply so that they don't find themselves in a very difficult situation solely because of the crisis. Now, that would apply to Alitalia as it does to other airlines as well. And then, after that, in terms of the Alitalia investigation, once we have this crisis behind us, that investigation, that's another issue to be dealt with separately. In terms of the consequences of the COVID-19 crisis, that is what we're looking at now, and to provide support to help all of the companies affected. UK.
For the time being, we are in the transition period, and therefore UK is bound by stated rules, just like any member state. So they need to notify any stated measure, and they, to the extent they will need to provide emergency aid, like member states will have to do in order to cover for losses linked to COVID-19, they will benefit from the same treatment. So the dedicated point of contact is available to them, and the rapid treatment is available to them as well. Now on aid to banks, am I on? Yeah. On aid to banks, well, the ads we have seen so far, as I've said, are ads. Actually, the beneficiary of the ad are not the banks. The banks are the channel through which the state adds, in general, in particular, SMEs. And that is the case in Italy and in France so far. So these are not qualified as aid to bank. It cannot completely be ruled out that because of the, strictly because of this crisis, otherwise perfectly healthy banks would need to be added. And in that case, again, we will do it like for any other sector under the 7.2b, or if as the case may be, under 7.3b, or even under 7.3c. But for as long as this would be strictly linked to the crisis, this would not be an aid to the bank in the traditional sense of it, with all the consequences that it involves in the prudential framework.
Yeah, I skipped over the question for the UK. To be very clear, we're not saying anything about the UK in these numbers. So.
Okay, so I had questions here from Jorge.
Hello, good morning. Jorge Valero with Euractiv. Two questions as well. The first one on your economic analysis. This, let's say, technical recession that we will have this year, how confident are you that growth will be back next year, and how much will depend that on the measures that the governments will take? And also linked to that, at what moment you will decide to activate the general escape clause, because, as you said, it will depend on whether this turns into a downturn. So, meaning, I guess, that whether this recession or temporary recession will continue next year.
Thank you. It's Thomas Mingiri from the Swiss Broadcasting Corporation. It's a bit connected to the previous question. Did you try to model what happens to convergence between the EU economies during this phase? And are you, in other words, worried that when it comes to recovery, we will see very diverging situations whereby some countries burdened by debt will have much less space for recovery and so on, something similar to what we have seen with the financial crisis 10 years ago? Thank you.
And Lily, I think, was the last question for this round, and then we go on for another one. No? Okay. So please go ahead.
So how confident am I about the bounce back? Now, let me be very clear. We are in a very, very uncertain situation, and I think one needs to approach these simulations also in that manner. I mean, uncertain factors include the trajectory of the spread of the virus, how rapidly it will the containment measures have effect, but also the containment measures itself have an impact, obviously, and so there is a lot of uncertainty. In our analysis, we expect a bounce back, but to your second question, we do believe that is for that to happen. It is crucial that a bold policy action is needed, because what one in economic terms would like to avoid is hysteria effects. So if the response is too tepid, then the likelihood of being in a crisis longer and having more second round effects are simply higher. So better to act quickly and decisively early on than to wait. Now, to the question, when would you activate, when would we activate this general clause? It's not something that the Commission on its own can activate. What is clear for this clause to be activated, it needs to be clear that there is not a local problem, but really a severe drop in output in the EU and the euro area as a whole. And on that basis, the Commission can propose, but the Council would still need to agree to activate it, and I cannot put a timeline on it. I think what is meaningful is that the Commission says we stand ready to do that. Then there was a question on convergence. I think also here applies the quicker we act, the lower are the risk of that. But it is clear that if you start from a situation of economic health, it is always easier to come back. So that is so we need to be very vigilant on it, and I think indeed also for that reason bold and decisive action is needed now.
Thank you. Unfortunately, we have only time for 3 more questions, so I will take Sam, who raised his hand in advance. It's Sam first, and then I'll go to Virginie.
I think I stole the micro.
Okay, there we are. Sam Fleming from the FT. Actually, it was partly answered already. It was about this famous escape clause. It would just be helpful if you could explain the advantages that confers in terms of flexibility, because clearly the other measures, tools that you mentioned, provide considerable flexibility already. So I just wondered what the additional, the added bonus, in a sense, this will provide if things do go into a generalised downturn and a proposition was made that it might be appropriate to activate it. Thank you.
If you could wait, or just Virginie, please.
Well, just picking up on Sam's comment, this general escape clause, whatever it's called in French, why not activate it straight away? You're saying it shouldn't just be a local issue. Well, of course, quite clearly, it's not a local issue. All economies will be affected. We're talking about recession for this year. So why not strike straight away and bring in something which is politically and symbolically valuable?
Hi, Bjarke from Politico. Just a couple, if I may. In terms of what happens after this crisis has been handled, it might be a very stupid question, but could you just explain what exactly happens? Do a bunch of countries fall into the EDP, for example? And could you imagine that the ESM should be ready to handle any potential candidates? And then very finally, the EIB, have you guys thought about anything like issuing corona bonds in order to finance some of the support? Thank you.
Innovative ideas there.
Yeah. Okay. Maybe to start with the latest one. To be honest, I have not thought about it. I think the issue here is maybe not so much the funding issue. I mean, the EIB is very capable of funding under essentially every circumstances. It is, I think, more the clearly if you give loans or finance, then that comes with a certain risk, and that counts against your capital. So the question is always more how do you deal with the capital implications of these of such transactions? And there clearly, to the extent that we still have capacity in the EU budget, and there's one, and I mentioned an example. We try to help there. Now, whether the EIB wants to issue Corona bonds, I don't know. But I don't think, quite frankly, that they would need it. I don't think that the issue is so much on the funding side. So what are the advantages of the general escape clause, and why don't we activate that now? I mean, this is I take these together. It does. You're right that already the flexibility in the other points, there is already a lot of flexibility, but it has one characteristic. It's all based on the individual countries, and the general escape clause gives flexibility, simply even more flexibility that goes beyond the flexibilities that are in there. Now, just to recall, I mean, for those of you who were there already in 2008 and 2009, there was at that point we didn't have the general escape clause at that point in time. Nevertheless, there was a significant fiscal response, but it meant that essentially about the whole EU went straight into excessive deficit and stayed there for quite some time. Now, it can be done. It has been done before. But it gives a bit of a double signal. On the one hand, you recommend something to do, and on the other hand, you put then the member state then subsequently in an excessive deficit procedure. So I think you need to see it a bit in that light. Now, what happens after the crisis? I think the key concern is clearly to relaunch. We have now acute restrictions also on the supply side of the economy. But it is important that the moment that people can go back to work normally, that we relaunch the economy very, very forcefully. And if we manage to do that, well, I think it is possible. But again, as I said before, it requires decisive action, and I think I would leave it to this. No, last thing on the general escape clause, I skipped over. Why not trigger now? Just to also just to say this is, as you can imagine, not a technical question. This is not just about technicality. This is not a light decision, and it's simply not for me to say if and when this needs to be happen. This is clearly well above my pay grade.
All right, thank you very much. Thank you to all the speakers. We will now move to the second part.
I think we're not close to that. So I think what we need to do now, and I think is to make sure we keep up the growth as much as possible, or limit the drop. And I think that should do the trick. But again, as I said, it does require action.
So thank you again, and we will now move to the second part of the technical briefing on the coronavirus investment initiative. Thank you.
Je veux bien. Oui, j'arrive. Il y en a. Parfait. Ça peut servir. Moi, je vais pas. Tout de suite, si vous pouvez me resservir, c'est parfait. Je n'étais pas censé de rester
Okay, so we will continue now with our technical briefing. We have here Gert and Koopman from DG Budget, the Director-General of DG Budget, and Marc Lemaitre, Director-General for Regional Affairs, and they'll give you an overview of the Coronavirus Response Investment Initiative, which was also proposed today.
Thank you very much. After these riveting presentations, I'm sure you will want to file your copy very quickly. So I will be brief, so there's some room for questions. Marc and I will do this together, and I'm speaking obviously on behalf of both. Now, you will no doubt have some questions about the Coronavirus Response Investment Initiative, and what I want to do is to explain what it actually is, how it works, how we tend to roll it out, and obviously what we want to achieve. So, in essence, as has just been explained, what is needed at this juncture more than anything else is liquidity that is addressed at needs which are very pressing. And in effect, what we're proposing today is to use unused cohesion policy funds to bring expenditure forward and to redirect it in the fight against the coronavirus. Obviously, we work with what we have, but what matters is that the liquidity that is available can be directed at saving lives and sustaining viable companies. I think Maarten explained that what matters most is that we avoid a situation where companies that are otherwise viable go under for want of income and liquidity. We do this by adapting the rules, and you'll see that these adaptations are really pretty strong. We'll apply them flexible, and we'll also give significant support to member states to actually make this happen. Now, the overall amount that is available for this would be of the order of 37 billion euros, of which 8 billion euros represents liquidity, which we are proposing to make available immediately to member states, so that they can use that to pay for their national contributions under cohesion policy interventions. As you know, in cohesion policy, member states have to make national contributions, and we co-finance. I'll say more about where these 8 billion euros come from, but what is important is that these 8 billion euros would be complemented by 29 billion euros in the EU budget that together with the 8 billion euros would therefore make available 37 billion euros in support. Beyond that, there is another 28 billion euros of available amounts, remaining amounts in the European Structural and Investment Funds, which will also benefit from these rules should member states wish to deploy them. Now, what is very important to note here is that this is cash. These are cash grants. In our previous presentation, Maarten explained that 1 billion euro is being rearranged in EFSI and then leveraged to generate 8 billion euros of impact. Obviously, the same can be done here. Member states are free to use this money and leverage it, so the economic effects could be multiples of this amount. Now, in terms of eligible expenditure, the rules we are proposing would allow 3 priorities identified in the communication to be targeted. First, healthcare expenditure in any part of the member state systems, including things like hospital equipment, inhalators, masks, anything that is needed to save lives, to keep the healthcare systems going at this juncture. So very important. Secondly, support to SMEs, for example, through working capital, either through guarantees, about which a lot was said, how they will be treated under state aid rules, for example. All of that is possible. But actually the money has to come from somewhere, so this is possible with the changes in the rules we apply and using existing funds. And then thirdly, for the European Social Fund, they can also support national short-term employment schemes. These are schemes where companies ask workers to reduce working hours, receive less pay, and this is then compensated through these short-term employment schemes. So this cushions the economic blow in the short run of the impact of the coronavirus crisis. Now let me give you an example for Italy, just so that you see a bit how this would work. There is at present 853 million euros available, which we would release immediately. That would be topped up, if it is used in the context of this initiative, by 1.46 billion euros from the EU budget to reach 2.3 billion euros. And beyond that, there would be another 9 billion euros that could be allocated to similar objectives. This is money that is unspent in existing cohesion envelopes. So how will we actually do that? This sleeping money, so the 8 billion euros, comes from monies that have been given to member states as pre-financing and which we would have to recuperate in May, June. So instead of doing that, we are proposing now, and this requires a change in legislation, that member states would not have to pay this money back and can use it for the objectives that I have just described. So that's a significant change. Secondly, and this is, I think, really revolutionary, we would make all expenditure to fight corona eligible as of the 1st of February 2020. I'll say more about what that actually means on the ground. And then thirdly, we would actually be facilitating within these funds transfers of monies between priorities so that they can be better targeted to the most pressing needs. You will have seen the legislation, draft legislation that we have published today. It's a Commission proposal, and we would like the Council and the Parliament to agree as fast as possible, ideally within 2 weeks, because we have to start to get the show on the road extremely quickly. Now, the objective is, therefore, not to enter into a huge reprogramming exercise to have very heavy new procedures. No, the objective is very simple, to use existing programs to commit funds in the next weeks. And we would be dealing with the paperwork, the adjustments, the regularization later, because, as I have explained, from the 1st of February 2020 onwards, if our proposal is endorsed, all this expenditure would be eligible in any event. So this goes very, very far indeed, obviously, if you think about what is possible at this juncture. Now, the distribution by member states of these amounts is presented in this table. Don't worry, this presentation is going to be available to you, of course, so I'm not going to walk you through it. Just to explain again where the totals come from. In the first column, you see these amounts which we are obliged to recuperate totaling 7.9 billion euros, and the distribution across member states. In the second column, you see the EU budget that could be made available to complement this, and the ratio between these two depends on the co-financing rates from the EU budget in the country in question. And as you know, typically poorer member states benefit from higher EU co-financing rates. That's why these numbers vary. The third column then simply presents the sum of the first two columns. There was a question earlier on to our president as to why the 25 billion euros had become 37 billion euros. Let me explain very briefly. When we presented this on Wednesday, we were still finalizing the estimations because we're working at breakneck speed, as you can imagine, and we looked at aggregates for the EU as a whole, so the total available at the bottom of this table in terms of liquidity, and we simply used the average co-financing rates that pertain to the entire budgets concerned, which would have given a much lower number. In fact, that gave us approximately 18 billion euros. So at that juncture, we estimated that the total would be 25. But in fact, because there's relatively a lot of money available in poorer member states, we can release bigger sums from the EU budget to reach this level of 37 billion euros. As I said, there's also 28 billion euros still available after allocation of these sums to the priorities. Now, this will not happen quickly unless we also work very expeditiously with a lot of energy and at the highest possible level. So one important feature here is that the Commission is setting up a high-level group, a task force involving Vice President Vestager, Commissioners Ferreira, Schmidt, Gentiloni, chaired by Commissioner Hahn, which is mirrored at Director-General level. And as you see, the presence of Commissioner Vestager here, which is very important for a variety of reasons, is particularly relevant because of what you have been listening to earlier on, namely the state aid dimension. So this group can also give advice ex ante on state aid issues so that whatever is done can be looked at from this perspective so that we are sure that state aid issues later on will not arise. We want to move very, very fast. So today we will be asking member states to nominate a senior minister and also a senior civil servant. We want to have the names by the 16th of March, close of play on Monday. We are targeting a first call at this level coming Wednesday, and our commissioners will be reaching out to the capitals already next week to discuss very operationally how this can be put in place. The overall objective, as I hope I'm conveying, is to use what we have, to be very pragmatic, very action-oriented, because time is now really crucial. It is really about the next few weeks and months that we have to work towards ensuring that the temporary shock to the economy doesn't become a permanent shock. We're talking about significant amounts of money. They are not fresh money, but they're money that is being brought forward rapidly and significantly and addressed to issues that will generate significant economic benefits and health benefits that are multiples, I repeat, of what could be achieved otherwise with these funds. It's very important to have good railway lines. It's very important to have concert halls, very important to have water purification sites. All of these things are vital. But when your economy is about to collapse and people are dying because your healthcare system is imploding, that's where you put the money first. So that's what we're essentially suggesting. That's why we think it's so important. Final point, we are at the end of this budget, of this MFF. So we know what we have in the kitty this year, and we're throwing, in principle, all of it at this challenge. But obviously, we have not yet an agreed multi-financial framework for the next 7 years. We don't know how long the corona crisis will take. We have a migration crisis as well at our borders. So this again underlines the importance of agreeing rapidly on a multi-annual financial framework. It shows the value added of the EU budget. These are two crises which everyone recognises require European coordination and require efficient intervention by the European institutions, mobilising the budget as well. Not having any clarity on this is a real problem, and that is why we are pushing very aggressively now for completion of these negotiations in these difficult times as soon as possible. Thank you very much. Marc.
Does it go on immediately? You will. Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. Indeed, in these testing times, European solidarity is of the essence. As President von der Leyen just said it, at this moment we all feel Italian. And we do have one European instrument which is emblematic from the point of view of solidarity, and it is the so-called EU Solidarity Fund. Fact of the matter is that the EU Solidarity Fund today can help member states being hit by natural disasters. Speak floods, storms, earthquakes, fires, droughts, but not extraordinary health emergencies as we are seeing it today. And this is why we are today proposing to extend the scope of the Solidarity Fund to exactly such major public health emergencies. Obviously, these do not produce any major damage to infrastructure as the Solidarity Fund normally functions. And this is why we would, for such health emergencies, consider the public response to the crisis in terms of extra public means being put to assist the population. Think now of so many isolated elderly people, for instance, in Italy, who clearly need some support. Secondly, obviously, the extra efforts which will be put into all types of medical support and medical equipment. And finally, all the measures which are being put in place to contain the spread of the virus in this particular case. We have proposed very concretely that the thresholds which would make member states eligible to the Solidarity Fund in this particular situation to be lower than for natural disasters. You can see the figures here. So the thresholds would be the lower of either 0.3% of the GNI of individual member states or 1.8 billion in current prices. Just to end on this, the EU Solidarity Fund is a very concrete expression of solidarity among Europeans because since its creation back in 2002, it has already provided support to hard-hit member states in more than 80 cases and for more than 5.5 billion euros. And incidentally, Italy is the member state that has received the highest support until now, for nearly half of that amount, even slightly more than half of that amount, 2.8 billion euros. Thank you.
Catherine Fior, EU reporter. The proposal on the budget and the money that you say the pre-financing, that's money not spent that was allocated to countries. Do you think there'll be any reluctance from those countries, not just to pursue this plan that you've proposed and not just claw the money back and then also not have to provide match funding for potential projects. They might say it's just they want cash back. Thank you very much. They don't want to pay into a fund. So do you see any reluctance coming from finance ministries?
Well, you don't need to push. Thank you for that question. Well, in fact, these are amounts which member states have not been able to use and which they would have to pay back under normal circumstances. So member states basically are being offered money now, which otherwise they would not have, instead of possibly getting this money back maybe only in 2023 or 24 or 25 or 26 when they finally manage to complete their expenditures. Just to illustrate this, Italy today is still owed, in inverted commas, nearly 2 billion euros under the previous financial perspectives, which ended, as you know, in 2013, because they haven't yet completed the expenditure. So I think under any, from any perspective, this is a very generous offer, but it comes with a strong recommendation to use it for what is now the most urgent need, the most pressing need, which is to fight the coronavirus. So I think they will be welcoming this because money now, for these purposes, is worth much more than money later in uncertain circumstances for purposes that will not possibly generate similar advantages.
Very concretely, Gert presented the case of Italy. We see what Italy is doing right now. Italy is ramping up expenditure on its public health system in order to get back, for instance, some retired health staff, in order to get respiratory devices, in order to enlarge the facilities for intensive care, which is what they are needing. What we are proposing is that exactly that expenditure could be financed from European funds. So I do not see how they would be uninterested by this very concrete proposal of ours.
Thank you, Vivian. Just a quick question on the shift from 25 to 37. So is it fair to write, and is it correct to write, that this cash comes from money which was not used by member states in cohesion fund, or is it more complex than that? Because I'm still a bit lost on expenditures and so on. The other thing, just would it be possible maybe to have the table as soon as possible on the website, or to have the email, because it was rather tiny.
The website, so you have it. I think it's also fair to say that the 37 represents unused amounts, but there is a difference between, if you will, the 8 and the other part of the allocation, the 29. The difference is that this first amount we have been discussing is the amount that member states would simply have to pay back. So this is really free liquidity, free cash, if you will, which they receive. The other part, the biggest part, represents monies that they are in principle entitled to if they submit projects that meet the requirements at this juncture. It's just that they haven't contracted these projects yet. And what we are doing is to make it possible, rather than contracting them according to the present objectives, to contract them, as Marc has also explained very graphically, for things that are super urgent and super important.
Thank you, please.
Can I just add
sorry, yes, of course.
It is very important to really measure very well the magnitude, this 8 billion euros, which member states will have at their disposal thanks to this proposal, which they wouldn't have had at their disposal if this proposal hadn't been put forward, in the exact context of cohesion policy. In cohesion policy, you have so-called annual pre-financing. So every year, we hand out some advance cash so that member states can be helped in implementing the projects which they have selected. Now, in a normal year, This annual pre-financing represents 10 billion euros. What will happen with this proposal is that member states will not have 10 billion euros, they will have 18 billion euros in order to press ahead, to accelerate, and to reprioritize, as we said, to really respond as should be to the crisis from the health point of view, from the economic point of view, through SME support and through short-time employment schemes.
Thank you. Please. Here in front and then afterwards.
Susana Freixo, SIC Portugal. Actually, I have a few questions. Well, first of all, should the countries pay back this money in a one-year time? Because I heard some MEPs yesterday saying that actually this is like more, this would work like a loan, meaning that this, free cash that you were talking about actually would be, well, the member state would have to give it back to the EU budget in 1 year time. So can you clarify that? So is this money that actually they can keep it and forever? On the second part of the money, when do you expect this money to flow to the member states? For instance, I see that, for instance, Portugal has 400 million. So I suppose they are, right now they can keep it. They can start using it. Can you explain this? And when would Portugal receive the extra 1,800? And so are you talking about next week, next month, until the end of the year? And if they're going to use this money that has not been authorized yet, so I suppose it's not affecting projects that have been authorized, but actually what's going to happen to 2021, 2023, because right now the Portuguese government is saying, well, no problem that the EU budget for the next MFF is not agreed yet because we have money for 3 more years. So actually what you're doing is frontlining this money, so it's not, the country is not going to have this money in the next 3 years time. Thank you.
The first one I can be very categorical. They don't have to pay this back. This is money which they are getting now, and if they implement their budget, which is what we're all doing together under this initiative, then they keep it. So let's be very clear about that. On the 400 and the 1,800, the way this would work is as follows. First of all of this is dependent on the Council and the Parliament deciding. Now, actually, the changes we propose are very surgical. They're effectively 2 changes. The rest is legalese, and we believe there is no reason why this cannot be expedited in terms of decision-making. As I think the President made clear earlier on, both Council and Parliament are operational in this respect, and we would want this done very, very quickly indeed. In fact, we've already reached out and we have reason to believe that this will be given urgent treatment. It will also be discussed, for example, in the Eurogroup on Monday. So this has to go fast. Once it is adopted, then in principle, under these new rules, the money can be committed. But we're not going to wait. We're going to, as I explained, start next week already to prepare this. There is really no time to lose. This is a matter of weeks, not months. So we start to prepare next week. We hope that the proposal will be adopted very shortly. And then on that basis, member states can contract, buy the healthcare equipment, set up the temporary worker schemes, give guarantee schemes to SME and all that. So this can be done really very quickly. Now, what you're referring to is about the longer term and the fact that there is still a lot of money that will flow to member states. That's a different matter. That is related to payments on already existing commitments which member states have undertaken under the structural funds, which are finding their way through the verification and validation procedures. And the question you put was actually, maybe we don't need this financial framework so urgently because they still have all this cash that they will receive. It's true that they will be receiving this cash, provided obviously the checks demonstrate that they are fully owed this cash. But the problem for them is that from 2021 onwards, they cannot enter into new contracting at scale, which is what it is all about. So it's one thing if you are repaid, it's nice to be repaid, But you want to build your new fast train lines. You will want to get on with implementing your greening policies. You will want to start dealing with those communities which Marc and I were talking about earlier on when we discussed the Just Transition Fund, which will not exist if we don't have a new MFF. So I think the idea that we have time and since there's cash coming, there is no problem if we don't have a budget is a serious mistake. That would mean effectively hypothecating the future because you will not be able to get these new projects going. So I think that would be a terrible idea. I think most governments know this, and I think most governments realize very well that actually having such a new multi-annual framework in place is essential.
Let's take the example of Portugal indeed. You saw 400 million here in the table, which, as Gert said, is money which Portugal today has, and which, if rules don't change, will have to reimburse to Brussels before mid-year. So we need to change the rules before mid-year. Secondly, as I said, there is the normal pre-financing. Here we will be accelerating it, and we will be in the coming weeks paying the normal annual pre-financing to Portugal. How much is that? 600 million. So Portugal will have 1 billion. 1 billion to do exactly what you have pointed to implement projects, and I have no doubt that the Portuguese government will want to put European funds to use to counter this crisis in the health sector and to support the economy, to do how much? Some, let's say, 2 billion of projects altogether. And then you ask, when is that money going to come? Well, if Portugal indeed is quick, sets up quick SME support schemes, quick schemes for short-time work, Portugal can ask for reimbursement of the second column still this year as well, which reinforces the point. We all see we need to reply to the crisis. We all need to accelerate the mobilization of European funds, and this means we need to know what the future is about, what the next MFF is about, so that we can continue to plan and to foresee, indeed, infrastructure projects, you name it, for the future.
Yeah, but my question is also what's going to happen to the other projects that were expecting this money? So aren't you taking money from other kind of sectors and putting in new projects? So actually, aren't you just switching money from one side to the other, creating a problem in on the other areas and other projects?
As I said, the question is what is most urgent and what has the highest impact in the economy and what has the highest impact in terms of saving lives. It is true, of course, you can only spend €1 once. Huh? So if you take this from a planned pipeline of projects that would give you a wonderful concert hall, then you will not have the concert hall. But I think everyone at this juncture is thinking very hard about what the priorities are. The priorities, with every respect, are not concert halls, or even building very quickly the next part of your infrastructure line. The priorities now are to make sure that the economy doesn't go down the drain. The EU budget is a bit over 1% of GNI, so we cannot use it to do huge new things. That space is simply not available in the last year of a financial perspective. But what we can do, and that's what we're proposing here, is to offer unprecedented liquidity. And I remind you, if you were really to use the full amount here, so say you were mobilizing 50 billion euros, which is possible, and you do it intelligently, so you also use financial instruments, and this is actually really macroeconomically relevant. This would be a bit less than 0.5% of GNI, all to be committed in one go, directed at what is needed. This is relevant. So, we can't work wonders with what we have. The budget is what it is, but you can actually get a lot of mileage out of it at a time when it is needed, in a direction where it is needed.
Good morning, Jorge Valero with Euractiv. Two clarifications, actually. The first one, for what you're saying, you won't change the distribution among member states of the funds already allocated. But have you considered actually, let's say, considering this new solidarity or renewed solidarity to propose that? I mean, is there a possibility, legally speaking, of asking that to member states? And secondly, in order to unlock this up to 37 billions, for what I understood, what would be needed is member states to propose plans. I mean, those 8 billions is already there and they can spend them. But in order to access or to lift this to 37, they will need to propose plans for SMEs, health sector, so on and so forth. And very quickly, regarding the Solidarity Fund, how much is available right now within the Solidarity Fund, and these funds will come on top of the 37 billions. Is that correct? Thank you.
Now listen, in an ideal world, there is a lot you could do if you had the time to optimize, if you will, your instrument kit. And if you look at the distribution across member states, I'm not claiming that the money is there where, in exact proportion to where the needs are the biggest. We work with what we have. This is the money that is available there. And if we were to redesign the system completely, one thing is absolutely certain, that decision-making would simply be too slow for this to be relevant. So that's why we want to limit the scope of any legal changes as much as possible, because realistically, this can be done in 2 weeks, the decision-making by Council and Parliament. Anything that goes much beyond it will simply come too late for it to be relevant. That's a discussion we need to have in the context of the next MFF, of the next programs. Now we're dealing with a crisis, and we use what we have as quickly as possible. In terms of the Solidarity Fund, I leave it to Marc, obviously.
Just to add one point to the question, to the first question, is the money where it should be? Look at the table. I don't think you will find one member state where you would say, well, that looks like too high an amount to react to the crisis, right? So I think that certainly these amounts are very, very relevant in each and every line, individualizing the member states. On the Solidarity Fund, we have, for the year 2020, an amount available of 800 million euros. And when it comes to next year and the following years, it will again depend on getting an agreement on the multi-annual financial framework. The proposal from the Commission was to foresee an amount of 600 million in 2018 prices for the Solidarity Fund for the coming period. And that is also an annual amount, so 600 million next year and in the following, and in each of the successive years. Per year.
Could I just add one thing, that even in the course of this year, there will be some additional money that will be unblocked, which would bring the total to 1,150,000,000 euros. Some of that will come a bit later in the year, but in any case, as you know, the Solidarity Fund makes it possible to reimburse member states after they have incurred the cost. So this is it's a material contribution, obviously not at the same size as deploying for liquidity purposes the remaining amounts in the Cohesion Fund, but this is solidarity, as Marc has said, and it is extra, it's on top.
Thank you very much, Lee from Politico. The Commission and you as well in this technical briefing has been really focused on the need to address the emergency and to bring the money where the need is. But when we look at the numbers, we see that Poland will actually be getting more out of your free cash, for lack of a better term, than Italy, where the death toll is now over 1,000 people. I believe Poland will be getting over $1 billion worth of this money Italy will only be getting a bit over 800 million. And I know for technical reasons, Italy is a wealthy member state and has to do with what was already spent. But from a citizen's perspective, looking at it, how can you explain the decision-making and the thought process that led to a country that has been very little affected by the coronavirus crisis, getting a lot more money than the country most impacted? Thank you.
Thank you, Lily. I mean, just to come back to what I said before, had we had time and comfort to design a tool with new money, we probably wouldn't have arrived at this precise allocation that is there today. Because what this precise allocation simply reflects is the reality of what individual member states have left over in the kitty, in the cohesion kitty, so to speak, and what they are owed, what we are owed from them in terms of repayments on this pre-financing. So, if you want to act in the next weeks, you can only use what you have. You cannot change this across member states. It's excluded. If we were to propose a reallocation across member states, we would probably be standing here next year if we were very fast. So that doesn't make any sense. So we're not pretending, I'm not pretending for a second that this is an optimal allocation, but I do very much want to underline what Marc just said. These are material results in every member state. Because take the line of Italy. In addition to the 853 liquidity, there is, which would, together with the co-financing from the budget, generate 2.3 billion euros of investments for which they would not have to use any national money whatsoever. There would still be nearly 9 billion euros sitting in the cohesion envelope, of which they would have to co-finance about half. That can also be used for this. So that's another 4.5 billion euros. I mean, these are very significant amounts. You have to keep a perspective of what the amounts are we're talking about. You remember the discussions on some of the MFF instruments for 7 years. The Just Transition Fund, 7.5 billion euros for 27 member states over 7 years. Here we're talking for Italy alone. If they were to fully use what we have put on the table, you're looking at 11.3 billion euros in one country in 1 year. So, if you use this intelligently, you leverage part of it, and you direct it at where it is most needed. This is very, very significant. And I think that is basically why we believe that this makes sense, why we believe member states should engage quickly and will engage quickly. I am convinced.
The President a moment ago said that the situation is a very, very fast evolving one. And I think that we need to take that into account as well. And I would again dare to claim that these individual amounts by member states will all prove to be very, very relevant and certainly not exaggerated for each member state to put in place the measures which they will have to put in place to indeed try to cushion off the economy, try to cushion off the wave of layoffs, of potential layoffs which will hit us, and to all beef up their capacities in the health sector. So this is why I do not think that the issue is one of distribution here. The issue is whether this money can be put to best and speediest use in the interest of each and every individual member state.
Please, one last question.
Hello, thank you. Amazoleka Public Policy. I have a question about this liquidity. So this money was provided to the regions and local communities as structural and cohesion funds. I was wondering, in this framework of help, will the original destination of this fund be respected? I mean, the money allocated to Tuscany, will it stay in Tuscany, or will the Italian government have the possibility to use it also in other regions? And also another question about the MFF, considering that the deal on the new MFF seems pretty difficult to achieve in the next future. is the Commission already thinking about an exit strategy, such as a special budget for the 2021, as it was requested by the Parliament? Thank you.
On your first question, very briefly, already under the existing rules today, it is possible to move money subject to certain limits between different regions, provided that they are in the same category when it comes to economic development. But I would like to make a very basic point, which is that if you look at Italy, if you look at the developed regions, that is actually, as it happens, the area where the bulk of the unused commitments are to be found. So, again, this is something where we are very lucky that the money is there, but a lot of it is exactly where it should be, where the epicenter of the problems are. On the MFF, as I said before, we actually believe that these two crises we are confronting today should help leaders to agree rapidly on a framework for the future. It is really inconceivable, to be honest, that for both policies where you need a long-term perspective, because the migration problems are not going to go away this year in 2020, you need a long-term perspective. Same for the borders, same for the economic fallout here. You need this longer-term perspective. I really believe that this is a stark reminder, probably the starkest possible reminder, of the need to move now. And that is certainly an argument which the President of the Commission and the senior leadership of the Commission will be making with even more intensity than they have been making it so far.
Thank you. Thank you.
To put it easily, in uncertain times, you need to create certainty where you can.
On this positive note, thank you very much. Thanks to everyone for coming and also to the interpreters.